What if that old religious painting in your home is more than just decoration? What if it's not just an image, but a doorway? One of the most beloved mystics of the 20th century, Padre Pio, revealed something both chilling and divine about the sacred images we often overlook in our homes. He didn't see them as mere art. He saw them as something alive with meaning, capable of protecting, guiding, even warning us. Whether you're deeply faithful or just spiritually curious, what you're about to discover might completely change the way you see that crucifix above your bed, that painting of the Virgin Mary in your hallway, or the Sacred Heart glowing quietly in your grandmother's living room. Because according to Padre Pio, these images are anything but silent. Sacred images have been a part of human homes for centuries. Long before the age of smartphones, screens, and digital distractions, families lived with symbols that spoke directly to their souls. In quiet corners, in the heart of humble kitchens, above the beds of children, and beside the doors of the elderly, religious paintings weren't just decoration. They were companions, witnesses, reminders of something greater than the world outside. Walk into any traditional home from generations past, and chances are you'd find at least one holy image looking back at you. Maybe it was the soft, sorrowful gaze of the Virgin Mary, or the strong open arms of Jesus with his Sacred Heart exposed. Maybe it was St. Michael with his sword drawn, standing as protector over the household. These weren't chosen at random. They weren't placed for style or design. They were there for a reason, and that reason was deeply spiritual. Our grandparents didn't just hang these on the wall. They prayed beneath them, cried in front of them, hoped through them. In moments of loss, they would kneel in silence before these images. In times of joy, they'd lift their eyes in gratitude to the face of Christ or the Madonna. Every candle lit, every rosary whispered, every sigh of "please help me" was offered in the direction of these sacred representations. They were anchors when life felt unsteady, a reminder of heaven in the middle of a storm. But there's something even deeper. Padre Pio, who carried the wounds of Christ and saw into the souls of countless people, believed that sacred images held a kind of spiritual charge. Not in a superstitious way, but in a way that reflected the truth of what they symbolized. He taught that when an image is created with devotion and blessed with prayer, it doesn't remain just an object. It becomes a spiritual signpost, a channel through which grace can flow. Think about that for a moment. That humble portrait of the divine mercy in your hallway might actually be radiating a silent invitation to pray. That little icon of Our Lady by your bed may be filling the space with peace as you sleep. These aren't magical talismans. They don't replace faith or prayer. But when placed with intention, when chosen and honored as sacred, they can become real spiritual companions in the journey of life. This is why, even in times of persecution, when churches were closed or priests were hunted, the faithful still clung to their images. In secret, in the dark, they would pull out a folded image of Jesus from beneath the floorboards. They'd kiss it, weep over it, ask it to carry their prayers to heaven. These images gave hope when everything else was falling apart. And it's not just in times of crisis. For centuries, entire cultures have used religious art to shape the spiritual atmosphere of a home. In Eastern Christianity, the tradition of the icon corner is a sacred space set aside for prayer, lit by candles, and adorned with holy images. In Latin America, it's common to see the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe watching over living rooms, kitchens, even cars. In Italian homes, you'll often find the Sacred Heart right near the front door, a quiet blessing to anyone who enters or leaves. Padre Pio once said, "The home must be a small sanctuary, not just of people, but of the spirit." And sacred images? They help build that sanctuary. They remind us that life is more than chaos and bills and scrolling. They lift our eyes to something eternal. And when chosen with care, when treated with reverence, they do more than decorate. They invite holiness into the ordinary. But what happens when we stop seeing them? When we walk past them every day and don't even notice? When they become background noise instead of sacred presence? That's the danger. And that's what Padre Pio warned us about. Because if these images can bless, they can also be neglected. And when we forget their purpose, we forget part of our own. There's a story, quiet, almost forgotten, about Padre Pio and a simple image of Christ. It happened during one of his many moments of spiritual reflection. He was sitting with a close friend, someone who often assisted him, someone who had seen him move between the visible and invisible world with startling ease. In that still moment, Padre Pio's eyes fixed on a small, humble painting of Jesus hanging on the wall nearby. Without turning his head, almost as if the words were meant for the painting itself, he whispered, "These images are not lifeless. The sacred moves through them." It wasn't poetic. It wasn't meant to inspire. It was a warning. Padre Pio, this man marked by the wounds of Christ, known for reading hearts, seeing the unseen, and battling demonic forces, believed with all his soul that holy images are not neutral objects. They are vessels. Some carry grace. Others, if corrupted, carry something darker. To Padre Pio, a religious image wasn't just a picture. It was a portal. He taught that when an image is blessed, when it's received with faith, placed with prayer, and honored with love, it becomes more than art. It becomes a channel of grace, a point of contact between heaven and earth, a spiritual companion in the silence of your home. But the reverse is also true. There were moments when people would come to him, proud of the religious objects they owned. They'd bring paintings, icons, statues, sometimes with excitement, sometimes looking for validation. And Padre Pio would go silent. He would stare at the image, and then calmly but firmly he would say something that shook them. Remove it. Not every religious image carries holiness. That's what most people don't understand. Some images, he explained, are made without reverence, produced for profit, crafted without care, sometimes even manipulated spiritually by those who don't believe. And others, they may have once been holy, but became corrupted through use in places filled with pain, curses, or spiritual neglect. Padre Pio believed that the spiritual realm, what most of us can't see, interacts constantly with our physical world, and certain objects, especially religious ones, become receivers of that energy, both light and dark. He once warned a woman who came to him complaining of constant unrest in her home. She prayed, she lit candles, but still her family was plagued by arguments, anxiety, and an unexplained heaviness in the air. Padre Pio asked her a simple question: "What is above your fireplace?" She hesitated, then said, "A painting of the Madonna and Child. It belonged to my grandmother." He closed his eyes and then said, "It was never blessed. It passed through unclean hands. Remove it. Burn it if you must. Then replace it with something truly sacred." It wasn't superstition. It was spiritual clarity. Padre Pio believed that what we bring into our home spiritually matters just as much as who we bring in physically. He also taught that even beautiful things can become distorted if they're used without reverence. He was especially cautious of mass-produced images that were treated like fashion trends, bought because they look nice, not because they were chosen in prayer or meant to deepen faith. And this teaching wasn't just for the overly devout. It was for everyone. Because, in his words, the devil doesn't need permission, only an open door. An unblessed image, or one that carries the spiritual residue of darkness, can be that door. That's why Padre Pio encouraged people to bless everything that entered their homes, statues, images, even crosses. He emphasized that holiness is not automatic. It must be invited, protected, nurtured. There's another lesser-known story of a young man who received a stunning painting of Saint Michael the Archangel as a gift. It was vibrant, majestic, even intimidating in its beauty. But soon after bringing it home, things began to shift. Nightmares, sudden anger, objects falling for no reason. When he brought it to Padre Pio, the mystic stared at the painting, then asked, "Do you know where this was painted?" The man said it was from an artist known for his intense, even violent themes. Padre Pio replied, "He carries that into his work. It is not the face of St. Michael, it is the shadow of him." He then advised the man to have the image destroyed and replaced with one that had been created by someone who lived in grace and whose hands were guided by faith. This might sound extreme, even unsettling, but for Padre Pio, it was part of his daily spiritual reality. He constantly reminded those around him that the battle between good and evil isn't just in the abstract. It lives in the details. in what we see, what we listen to, what we hang on our walls. And perhaps the greatest danger isn't in the image itself, but in forgetting its purpose. You must look at it as you would look at him, he once told a man who confessed he no longer felt moved by the crucifix in his bedroom, because he is looking back at you. So now consider this. What images live on your walls? Have they been chosen with intention? Have they been blessed? Do they bring peace? Or do they simply exist in silence, ignored, dusty, forgotten? Because according to Padre Pio, they are never truly silent. They speak, they transmit, they receive. And the question is, what are they bringing into your life? For most people, a painting is just a painting, a canvas, a surface, a mix of color and brushstroke that captures a moment or a figure. But for Padre Pio, it was something far more profound. He believed that religious images, when created and chosen with faith, act like windows to the divine. Not just symbols, but openings. Not merely decorations, but invitations to the sacred, to heaven, to grace. He used to say that just as a window lets in light, a holy image lets in the presence of the one it represents. It doesn't become God. It doesn't replace prayer. But it allows something heavenly to enter a space that would otherwise remain so ordinary. And when that window is opened through love, through blessing, through devotion, it can transform the entire atmosphere of a home. One of the most beautiful stories that illustrates this comes from a woman named Maria, who lived in southern Italy, just a few towns away from where Padre Pio served. She was a widow with 3 children, struggling to keep her family together after her husband's sudden death. Her days were filled with grief, her nights with silence, the kind of silence that weighs heavy in the corners of a house. She heard about Padre Pio from a neighbor who had traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo and returned with stories of his holiness, his prayers, his strange ability to speak to souls without a single word. Maria wasn't a mystic. She wasn't overly religious, but she was desperate for peace. So one day, she saved enough to make the journey herself. When she finally met Padre Pio, she didn't ask for money or a sign. She simply asked if he could pray for her home. He looked at her gently and said, "I will, and take this with you." He handed her a small painting of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, simple, humble, nothing grand. And then he placed his hand on it, blessed it in silence, and added only one sentence: "Hang it where the pain sits." Maria returned home. She walked into her kitchen where so many tears had fallen, where meals had gone uneaten, where chairs stood empty. She took down a dusty old clock that had long stopped working and hung the painting in its place. Then she sat, and she waited. She didn't hear voices. No thunder rolled in the sky, but something shifted, slowly, quietly. That night, her youngest child came into the kitchen and said, "Mama, the room feels different. It's warmer now." Over the following days, the heaviness began to lift, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but like smoke clearing after a fire. A little more sunlight through the window, a little more laughter during dinner, less arguing, less fear. Maria began to pray in front of that painting each morning, a simple thank you and sometimes a whispered plea. And what she noticed was this: her home became peaceful again, not perfect, but peaceful. Years later, when her children were grown and had families of their own, they would still point to that painting above the kitchen table and say, "That's where it started again. That's where the healing came." Now, was it just a painting, or was it a window? Padre Pio believed that when an image of Christ, Mary, or the saints is blessed and honored, it becomes a spiritual threshold, a point of connection between the physical world and the spiritual one. That's why he urged people not to just own sacred art, but to interact with it, to pray with it, to see it not just with their eyes, but with their hearts. He often spoke of how the spiritual world is never far, it's just unseen. But through sacred objects, we are reminded, we're drawn upward. We are, even if briefly, lifted into that invisible reality. And it wasn't only Maria. There are stories, countless whispered and passed down, of people who experienced moments of unexplainable peace while kneeling before a blessed image, of tears drying without reason, of marriages reconciled, of anxiety silenced. Not because the painting itself had power, but because it opened a space where heaven could breathe into earth. Think about your own life. Have you ever felt comforted in front of an image of the Virgin Mary? Or found unexpected strength while staring into the face of the suffering Christ? Have you ever walked into someone's home and felt peace wash over you, not because of furniture or candles, but because of a single sacred image standing silently in the corner? That's not coincidence. That's atmosphere. And it raises a deeper, more personal question. Could it be that what we choose to display opens the spiritual climate of our homes? Could it be that certain images invite peace, while others, ignored, unblessed, or placed carelessly, simply add noise to a space already filled with chaos? Padre Pio didn't want us to fear sacred art. He wanted us to respect it, to understand its potential, to see it not with worldly eyes, but with spiritual ones. In a world that often tries to strip meaning from the visual, reducing everything to trend and taste, his words remind us that beauty has purpose and presence. So maybe it's time to look again at that crucifix above your door, at that painting in your hallway, at the face of Christ, the hands of Mary, the sword of St. Michael, not as things, but as signs, as windows, as quiet messengers of a greater reality, waiting to be seen not just with your eyes, but with your soul. Padre Pio never spoke casually about sacred things. To him, treating holy images as mere decoration wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. He warned again and again that the spiritual world doesn't retreat just because we stop paying attention to it. In fact, that's exactly when it creeps in, when we become passive, distracted, apathetic. The devil laughs, he once said, when we forget the power of what hangs before our eyes. We place a crucifix above our bed, but forget to look at it. We keep an image of the Virgin Mary in our hallway, but rush past it every morning without a thought. We might even hang paintings of saints simply because they look vintage or match the color palette. Padre Pio believed this indifference is where spiritual confusion begins. When we forget the meaning of what we display, we leave space for something else to fill it. There's a short but telling story of a man named Lorenzo, a young professional raised Catholic but distanced from faith, who moved into an old family home left to him by his grandmother. In the living room, above the fireplace, hung a large image of Christ crucified, a painting that had been there for decades. Lorenzo didn't remove it, but he didn't care for it either. He never prayed in front of it, never acknowledged it. Over time, the image became invisible to him, a relic of an old woman's beliefs. And yet, shortly after moving in, he began to feel unsettled. At first, it was small things: restless sleep, an odd tension between him and visitors, a subtle but constant sense of heaviness in the air. He began having strange dreams, waking up at 3 a.m. with no explanation. Eventually, in a moment of frustration, he vented to a colleague, someone who happened to be a person of deep faith. She asked him, "What's on your walls?" He didn't understand. She pressed, "Anything sacred?" He mentioned the painting. She went silent. Then she said, "Don't ignore it. Bless it. Pray in front of it. If it's been forgotten, it needs to be reclaimed." That evening, Lorenzo, awkwardly unsure, lit a candle and stood before the painting for the first time. He didn't have the words, so he just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the face of Christ. And something shifted. That night, he slept peacefully. The air in the house felt lighter. And he began to wonder how long that sacred image had been waiting, not to be seen, but to be remembered. So what can we do? If these images carry spiritual weight, if they truly are more than decoration, how do we make sure they serve their purpose? Padre Pio gave simple, humble advice. Treat them with reverence. That's where it begins. Start by making sure the image is blessed. It may sound small, but blessing a religious image is a powerful act. It's an invitation, a way of saying this space belongs to God. Whether through a priest or even with your own sincere prayer, the blessing dedicates the image as sacred. Then think about where you place it. Padre Pio once told a family, "Place it above your door so the angels know where to enter." For him, the placement wasn't about style, it was about intention. The front door, the bedroom, the kitchen, wherever the heart of the home beats loudest, that's where grace should be visible. And then treat it as alive, not because it has magic, but because it represents something that does. Don't let the image gather dust. Don't walk past it day after day as if it's just another frame on the wall. Stop. Look. Whisper a short prayer. Even a glance toward Christ, a gentle touch on the edge of the frame, or a whispered thank you can transform that moment and your home. Honor the sacred with presence, not performance. Let that crucifix remind you of mercy. Let the face of Mary call you back to peace. Let St. Michael guard your household, not just in theory but in daily life, because according to Padre Pio, when we open our hearts to the sacred enters, and your home. It becomes more than shelter, it becomes a sanctuary. Maybe that dusty painting on your wall has been waiting to be seen again, to be prayed with, to be loved, not as an object, but as a window, a quiet, patient invitation from heaven, just hanging there, hoping you'd notice. Padre Pio knew this truth intimately. For him, the divine didn't only speak from the altar or through the pages of Scripture. It whispered through sacred images, glowed in candlelight, lingered in the gentle gaze of the Madonna on a kitchen wall. He believed that heaven isn't far away. It's right here, when we remember, when we stop long enough to look, to feel, to reconnect. So maybe it's time to look again, to bless what's been forgotten, to reclaim what's holy in your home. Have you ever felt something powerful while standing in front of a religious image? A moment of stillness, a breath of peace, a sudden warmth that can't be explained. Let us know in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to see with new eyes. And if this story moved your heart, wait until you hear what Padre Pio said about angels. Trust me, you won't want to miss that. So make sure to subscribe, tap the bell, and share this with someone whose home could use a little more light. Until next time, take care, and may peace always dwell in your home.